Imagine a world where Europe had no idea what lay beyond the horizon, where the Atlantic Ocean was called the Sea of Darkness, and sailors believed monsters waited to devour anyone brave enough to venture too far. Now imagine a small nation, barely visible on the map, that decided to challenge the unknown. Portugal didn't just explore the oceans. They revolutionized naval technology, redrew world maps, and connected continents that had never touched before. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how Portuguese ships didn't just sail the seas, they changed the entire course of human history. Before we dive into this incredible journey, hit that subscribe button and smash the like, because you're about to discover secrets of maritime innovation that changed everything we know about the world. I want you to close your eyes for a moment and travel back in time with me. It's the year 1400, and you're standing on the rocky shores of Portugal, staring out at the Atlantic Ocean. The waves crash against the cliffs with a sound that's both beautiful and terrifying. Behind you, Europe is locked in the grip of the Middle Ages, a world of limited horizons where most people never travel more than 20 miles from where they were born. But in front of you lies something far more daunting, the Sea of Darkness. That's what they called the Atlantic back then. Medieval maps ended at the African coast with warnings written in Latin. Here be dragons, and beyond this point the sea boils and demons rise from the depths. Sailors whispered stories of ships that ventured too far south and simply vanished, swallowed by mysterious forces or burned by the scorching sun that supposedly set the ocean on fire near the equator. Now, imagine you're part of a nation that decides to say no to these fears. A country that chooses to face the unknown, not with reckless abandon, but with careful planning, innovative thinking, and technological genius. That nation was Portugal, and over the next century they would do something unprecedented. They would transform humanity's relationship with the ocean forever. I'm not exaggerating when I say that Portuguese ships changed everything. Before Portugal's maritime revolution, the world was disconnected. Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas existed in isolation. Trade routes were controlled by Middle Eastern merchants who charged astronomical prices for spices, silk, and other exotic goods. The Mediterranean was the center of the known world, and the Atlantic was a terrifying barrier that nobody dared to seriously challenge. But Portuguese innovation changed all of that. They developed ships that could sail where others couldn't. They trained navigators who could find their way across trackless oceans. They built an empire that stretched from Brazil to Japan, and in doing so, they created the first truly global civilization. The age of discovery didn't just happen, it was engineered, and the vessels that made it possible were floating marvels of 15th century technology. In this deep dive, I'm going to take you on a journey through the revolution that began in the shipyards of Portugal. We'll explore the innovations that made these vessels superior to anything else on the water. We'll meet the visionaries who dreamed of reaching the ends of the earth, and we'll discover how these wooden ships, powered by nothing but wind and human courage, connected our world in ways that still resonate today. So let me ask you, are you ready to discover how a nation smaller than the state of Indiana managed to dominate the world's oceans and change history forever? Then let's set sail. Let's start with the vessel that made it all possible, the caravel. Now, if you're imagining massive warships with hundreds of cannons, you're going to be surprised. The caravel was actually relatively small, typically between 50 and 70 feet long. To put that in perspective, that's about the size of a modern tennis court. But what the caravel lacked in size, it more than made up for in revolutionary design. Before the caravel, European ships faced a fundamental problem. They couldn't sail efficiently against the wind. Medieval vessels like the cog were sturdy and could carry plenty of cargo, but they were essentially floating boxes that could only sail effectively when the wind was behind them. This limitation meant that exploration was incredibly risky. If you sailed south along the African coast with favorable winds, how would you get back home if the winds didn't cooperate? Many ships that ventured south never returned, not because of sea monsters, but because of this simple navigational reality. Enter the caravel. Portuguese shipbuilders, drawing on centuries of fishing experience along their treacherous coastline and influences from Mediterranean and even Arabic vessel designs, created something extraordinary. The caravel featured lateen sails, triangular sails that could catch wind from multiple angles. This design, combined with a shallow draft and a narrow, streamlined hull, meant that caravels could sail much closer to the wind than any European vessel before them. Let me explain what this meant in practical terms. A traditional ship might only be able to sail effectively when the wind was coming from behind or slightly to the side. But a caravel could sail at angles as close as 60 degrees to the wind. This capability, called beating into the wind or tacking, was absolutely revolutionary. It meant that Portuguese explorers could venture far from home with the confidence that they could return, regardless of wind conditions. The caravel was also incredibly maneuverable. Its lightweight and responsive design meant it could navigate coastal waters, enter river mouths, and explore shallow harbors that larger ships couldn't reach. For an explorer trying to map unknown coastlines, this was invaluable. You could get close to shore, spot landmarks, take depth soundings, and escape quickly if you encountered hostility from locals or dangerous waters. But here's what really amazes me about the caravel. It was fast. Contemporary accounts describe caravels reaching speeds of 8 to 9 knots under optimal conditions. That might not sound impressive by modern standards, but in the 15th century, this was blazing speed. A caravel could outrun larger ships and cover vast distances relatively quickly. When Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, he did it in a caravel. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, caravels were part of his fleet. The construction of these vessels was also remarkable. Portuguese shipbuilders used carvel planking, a technique where planks are laid edge to edge on the frame, creating a smooth hull, rather than the overlapping clinker planking common in northern Europe. This carvel technique, which gave the caravel its name, created a stronger, more watertight hull that could better withstand the pounding of ocean waves. Inside, the caravel was efficiently designed for long voyages. Despite its small size, it could carry enough supplies for a crew of about 20 to 30 men for several months. Water barrels, dried fish, hardtack biscuits, and wine were stored below deck. Navigation instruments occupied a small cabin, and the crew slept wherever they could find space, often on the deck under the stars. But perhaps the most important innovation was psychological as much as technological. The caravel proved that ocean exploration was possible. It shattered the fear of the unknown by providing a reliable tool for discovery. Once, Portuguese sailors demonstrated that they could sail far south along the African coast and return safely. The mental barrier that had kept Europeans confined began to crumble. The caravel was so successful that other nations quickly copied the design. Spanish explorers used caravels extensively, including the famous Niña and Pinta from Columbus's 1492 expedition. But by that time, Portugal had already used these vessels to explore thousands of miles of African coastline, establishing trading posts and gathering invaluable geographic knowledge. Think about this for a moment. A relatively simple ship, built from wood, canvas, and rope, became the key that unlocked the entire world. The caravel didn't have engines, radar, or GPS. It was powered by wind and guided by stars, yet it took humanity farther than ever before. That's not just good engineering, that's genius. Behind every great technological revolution, there's usually a visionary who sees possibilities that others can't imagine. For Portugal's maritime expansion, that visionary was Prince Henry the Navigator. Now, here's an ironic fact that I love. Prince Henry himself never actually navigated any of the great voyages of discovery. He didn't personally sail to Africa or around the Cape of Good Hope. Yet his influence on ocean exploration was so profound that he earned the title the Navigator and became one of the most important figures in maritime history. Henry was born in 1394, the third son of King John I of Portugal. As a younger prince, he wasn't destined to inherit the throne, which actually gave him the freedom to pursue his passions. And Henry's passion was the ocean. More specifically, he was obsessed with the question, what lies beyond the known world? In 1415, Henry participated in the Portuguese conquest of Ceuta, a Muslim port city in North Africa. This experience changed his life. In Ceuta, Henry encountered merchants who told stories of gold, ivory, and exotic goods that came from deep in the African interior. He learned about trans-Saharan trade routes that had operated for centuries, bringing wealth from sub-Saharan Africa to Mediterranean markets. Most intriguingly, he heard tales of a Christian kingdom supposedly ruled by a legendary figure known as Prester John, somewhere beyond the Islamic lands. These discoveries ignited something in Henry. He returned to Portugal with a mission to explore the African coast, find a sea route to these sources of wealth, make contact with potential Christian allies, and expand Portuguese influence. But unlike many nobles of his era, Henry approached this mission systematically. He didn't just fund one or two expeditions and hope for the best. Instead, he created an entire infrastructure for exploration. Around 1418, Henry established himself at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal. This remote, windswept promontory overlooking the Atlantic became the center of Portuguese exploration efforts. Here, Henry founded what was essentially the world's first navigation school. He gathered the best minds he could find, experienced sailors, skilled cartographers, astronomers, mathematicians, and shipbuilders. Imagine Sagres as a think tank for exploration. Captains who returned from voyages would debrief, sharing every detail of what they'd discovered: coastal features, currents, wind patterns, depths, and harbors. Cartographers would update maps based on this information. Astronomers would refine navigation techniques using celestial observations. Shipbuilders would incorporate feedback to improve vessel designs. It was a systematic approach to knowledge gathering that was revolutionary for its time. Henry was relentless in pushing exploration forward. Year after year, he financed expeditions down the African coast. Initially, progress was slow and frustrating. Sailors were terrified of venturing beyond Cape Bojador, a point on the African coast where strong currents and harsh winds created treacherous conditions. Medieval superstitions held that this was the point of no return, where the ocean became impassable. For 12 years, expedition after expedition failed to pass Cape Bojador. Captains would approach the cape, lose their nerve, turn back, and make excuses. But Henry refused to accept defeat. He kept sending ships, kept encouraging captains, and kept refining techniques. Finally, in 1434, one of his captains, Gil Inez, successfully rounded Cape Bojador and returned safely. This might seem like a small achievement, but it was actually a massive breakthrough. Once Cape Bojador was conquered, the psychological barrier was broken. Portuguese explorers began pushing further south year after year. In 1441, they reached Cape Blanco. In 1444, they reached the mouth of the Senegal River. In 1460, the year Henry died, Portuguese ships had explored nearly 2,000 miles of African coastline. Henry never lived to see the ultimate fruits of his efforts. He died in 1460, 38 years before Vasco da Gama reached India and 46 years before the Portuguese reached the Spice Islands. But everything that followed was built on the foundation he created. The navigational techniques, the ship designs, the systematic approach to exploration, the training of expert sailors. All of this came from Henry's vision and persistence. What impresses me most about Prince Henry is that he was playing a long game. He invested enormous amounts of money and effort into exploration, with no guarantee of return. Many of his expeditions brought back little of commercial value in the early years. Critics called him obsessive and wasteful. But Henry understood something that his critics didn't. Exploration was an investment in knowledge, and knowledge would eventually translate into power and wealth. Henry also had a broader vision. Yes, he wanted to find gold and establish trade routes, but he also saw exploration as a religious mission, to expand Christianity, to find allies against Islamic expansion, and to increase human knowledge of God's creation. Whether you agree with his religious motivations or not, this sense of higher purpose gave the Portuguese exploration effort an ideological dimension that sustained it through decades of slow progress. By the time of his death, Prince Henry the Navigator had transformed Portugal from a small, relatively poor kingdom on the edge of Europe into a nation on the cutting edge of technology and exploration. The school he founded at Sagres had trained a generation of expert navigators. The expeditions he financed had mapped thousands of miles of previously unknown coastline, and the momentum he created would carry Portugal forward to become the world's first global empire. Henry never navigated the oceans himself, but he navigated something more important. He navigated Portugal's future into uncharted waters, and in doing so, he helped navigate humanity into a new age. Let me take you to one of the most dramatic moments in exploration history. It's 1434, and a young Portuguese captain named Gil Enos is standing on the deck of his caravel, staring at the waters ahead. He's approaching Cape Bojador, a stretch of the African coast that has become legendary among sailors, and not in a good way. This is the point where at least 15 previous expeditions have turned back in failure and fear. Cape Bojador was more than just a geographical feature. It had become a symbol of humanity's limits, the boundary between the known and the unknowable. Medieval European geography held that the world was divided into climatic zones, and the common belief was that below a certain latitude, the heat of the sun became so intense that the ocean literally boiled. Sailors believed that if they ventured too far south, their ships would be destroyed, their skins would turn black from the heat, and they would die horrible deaths. These weren't just superstitions held by ignorant peasants. These beliefs were endorsed by respected authorities. Ancient Greek geographers had theorized about uninhabitable zones near the equator. Church scholars had incorporated these ideas into their worldview. Even experienced captains, men who had spent decades at sea, genuinely feared what might happen beyond Cape Bojador. But there were also very real, very practical dangers at Cape Bojador. The cape is characterized by strong currents running southwest, away from the African coast. Violent winds often blow in the same direction. For ships with limited ability to sail against the wind, these conditions created a perfect trap. You could sail to Cape Bojador relatively easily with favorable winds, but the return journey was treacherous. Ships that ventured too close risked being swept out into the open Atlantic, unable to make their way back to the coast. Additionally, the waters around Cape Bojador are shallow and filled with reefs. The sea breaks violently over these hidden dangers, creating a chaotic, foaming barrier that looks genuinely terrifying from the deck of a small ship. To sailors in the 15th century, this churning water seemed to confirm their worst fears about the boiling sea. Gil Enos had already attempted to pass Cape Bojador once before and had turned back like all the others. But Prince Henry the Navigator, who had personally selected and trained Enos, refused to accept defeat. He called Enos to Sagres and had a frank conversation with him. According to historical accounts, Henry essentially told Enos, "Look, these fears are based on stories, not facts. Use your training. Use your skills. Try a different approach. Henry suggested a strategy. Instead of hugging the coast as previous captains had done, sail well out to sea to avoid the dangerous currents and reefs, then turn south and approach the Cape from farther offshore. This was counterintuitive. It meant sailing away from the safety of the coast into the open ocean, but it might work. So in 1434, Inez tried again. This time, he sailed his caravel far out to sea, well away from the coast. He turned south, passing Cape Bojador at a safe distance offshore. And then, nothing dramatic happened. The sea didn't boil, his skin didn't burn, the ship didn't sink into a whirlpool. He sailed past the feared cape, continued south for a ways, and then, using the caravel's ability to sail against the wind, made his way back north and safely returned to Portugal. When Inez reported his success, the reaction must have been extraordinary. He had shattered a barrier that had existed for decades. He had proved that the fears were groundless. The ocean beyond Cape Bojador was just ocean. Dangerous, yes, but navigable with skill and the right ship. Inez brought back proof of his achievement. Samples of plants he had collected from the shore beyond Cape Bojador. These were plants no European had seen before. Tangible evidence that he had ventured into the unknown and returned. It wasn't gold or spices, but it was something more valuable at that moment. It was proof that the world beyond the Cape was real and reachable. The breakthrough at Cape Bojador fundamentally changed the psychology of exploration. Once Inez demonstrated that it could be done, other captains followed quickly. The pace of discovery accelerated dramatically. Within a decade, Portuguese ships had pushed hundreds of miles farther south. Within 2 decades, they had reached the tropical regions of West Africa. Within 6 decades, they had rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. But here's what fascinates me most about this story. The biggest barrier to exploration wasn't actually technological, it was psychological. Portuguese ships had been capable of passing Cape Bojador for years. The caravel design that made it possible was already in use. The navigation techniques were already known. What was missing was the courage to challenge accepted beliefs and the willingness to risk the unknown. Inez didn't have any special equipment that previous captains lacked. He didn't have better maps or superior navigation instruments. What he had was determination, better strategy, and a willingness to try a different approach. Sometimes, the most important innovations aren't new technologies. They're new ways of thinking. The conquest of Cape Bojador teaches us something profound about human progress. How many other impossible barriers exist only in our minds? How many other fears are based on stories rather than facts? The Portuguese explorers of the 15th century showed that when we challenge our assumptions and face our fears with reason and courage, we often discover that the monsters we imagined don't actually exist. Of course, I should note that while the Portuguese overcame their fears of the unknown ocean, their expeditions down the African coast had devastating consequences for the African peoples they encountered. The same ships that brought back geographic knowledge also initiated the Atlantic slave trade. This is the complicated legacy of the Age of Discovery, technological achievement and human tragedy intertwined. As we celebrate the innovation and courage of these explorers, we also need to remember the terrible costs that followed. But on a purely technological and psychological level, the breakthrough at Cape Bojador remains one of the pivotal moments in history. It was the moment when humanity's self-imposed boundaries began to dissolve, when we realized that the world was larger and more accessible than we had imagined, and when a new age of global connection became inevitable. Now, as successful as the caravel was for exploration, the Portuguese quickly realized they needed something different for the next phase of their maritime expansion. Once you've discovered new lands and established trade routes, You need ships that can defend those routes, carry large cargoes, and survive the incredibly long voyages to Asia and back. Enter the carrack, Portugal's answer to the need for ocean dominance. If the caravel was a sports car, fast, nimble, and perfect for exploration, then the carrack was a heavily armored SUV capable of crossing continents. These were massive vessels by 15th century standards, typically between 200 and 600 tons, though some grew even larger. To give you perspective, a carrack could be over 100 feet long and 40 feet wide, dwarfing the modest caravels that had pioneered the exploration routes. The carrack combined the best features of different shipbuilding traditions. From Mediterranean ships, it borrowed the carvel planking technique that created strong, smooth hulls. From Northern European designs, it adopted multiple masts with square sails that were excellent for long-distance ocean sailing. The typical carrack featured 3 or 4 masts. The foremast and mainmast carried large square sails for power, while the mizzenmast carried a lateen sail for maneuverability. Some larger carracks had a 4th mast, the Bonaventure mizzen, for additional control. This hybrid sail plan was brilliant. The square sails provided tremendous power when sailing with favorable winds, allowing the carrack to maintain good speed while carrying heavy cargo. But the lateen sails gave the ship enough maneuverability to handle different wind conditions, making it more versatile than earlier Northern European ships. What really set carracks apart, though, was their capacity. These ships could carry enormous amounts of cargo, hundreds of tons of spices, silk, porcelain, and other trade goods. For a nation trying to establish profitable trade routes to Asia, this capacity was essential. A single successful voyage of a carrack loaded with spices from the Moluccas could generate profits that covered the cost of the entire expedition, and then some. But cargo capacity alone wasn't enough for the dangerous routes to Asia. Portuguese carracks also needed to be warships, and this is where they really shone. Carracks were armed with dozens of cannons mounted on multiple decks. A large Portuguese carrack might carry 40, 50, or even more cannons of various sizes. These weren't just for show. Portuguese carracks were floating fortresses that could dominate naval engagements throughout the Indian Ocean. The innovation here was integrating artillery into ship design in a way that no one had done before. Earlier ships might carry a few guns, but carracks were designed from the keel up to be artillery platforms. They featured reinforced gun decks with proper gun ports that could be closed in rough weather. The positioning of the cannons, the weight distribution, the structural reinforcement, all of this was carefully engineered. This firepower gave Portugal an overwhelming advantage in Asian waters. When Vasco da Gama arrived in India in 1498, and when subsequent Portuguese fleets followed, they encountered civilizations with rich histories and sophisticated cultures, but whose naval warfare had not developed heavy artillery. Arab dhows, Chinese junks, and Indian vessels were superb ships in many ways, but they simply couldn't match the broadside firepower of a Portuguese carrack. Portuguese commanders quickly realized they could dominate Asian trade routes through naval superiority. They didn't need to conquer vast territories on land. They could control the seas and force other traders to operate under Portuguese terms. This strategy of maritime dominance, backed by the military power of carracks, allowed Portugal to build a trading empire that stretched from Brazil to Japan, despite having a relatively small population. The design of carracks also reflected lessons learned from years of ocean exploration. They were built to survive the terrible storms of the Cape of Good Hope, the doldrums near the equator, and the typhoons of the Asian monsoon season. The hulls were constructed from the best timber, with multiple layers of planking in critical areas. The rigging was redundant. If one mast or sail was damaged, the ship could continue sailing on the others. Life aboard a carrack was both impressive and harsh. These ships carried large crews, sometimes 200 men or more on the biggest vessels. There were the sailors who handled the ship, soldiers who manned the cannons and protected against pirates, merchants who managed the cargo, priests who tended to spiritual needs, and often craftsmen like carpenters and blacksmiths who could make repairs at sea. The journey from Portugal to India and back could take a year or more. Ships left Portugal in March or April to catch favorable winds, sailed down the African coast, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and then crossed the Indian Ocean to arrive during India's trading season. They would load cargo and return, hoping to reach Portugal before the next year's fleet departed. It was an exhausting, dangerous journey, and many ships were lost to storms, disease, or shipwreck. But the profits from successful voyages were staggering. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were worth their weight in silver, sometimes gold, in European markets. A captain who completed several successful voyages could become wealthy. The Portuguese crown, which controlled the spice trade, generated enormous revenues. This wealth allowed Portugal to maintain its exploration efforts and build a global empire far beyond what a nation of its size could otherwise achieve. The carrack wasn't perfect. These ships were slower than caravels and harder to maneuver in tight quarters. They required large crews, which meant more mouths to feed and greater risk of disease. Their deep draft meant they couldn't enter shallow harbors that caravels could access. And maintaining these large, complex vessels required significant resources and expertise. But for their intended purpose, dominating ocean trade routes and projecting power across vast distances, carracks were exactly what Portugal needed. They represented the next evolution in naval technology, taking the lessons learned from caravels and scaling them up to create vessels capable of establishing a global empire. The influence of the carrack extended far beyond Portugal. Other European nations quickly recognized the advantages of this design and began building their own versions. Spanish galleons, which would become famous during the age of New World colonization, were direct descendants of Portuguese carracks. The English, Dutch, and French all developed similar large armed merchant ships for their own maritime ambitions. In many ways, the carrack was the first true ocean-going vessel designed for global commerce and warfare. It bridged the gap between medieval ships that rarely ventured far from shore and the great ships of the line that would dominate naval warfare in later centuries. And it all started with Portuguese innovation, driven by the need to protect and profit from the trade routes their caravels had discovered. Here's something that might surprise you. For a period in the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal's most valuable military asset wasn't its ships or its cannons. It was paper, specifically maps and charts, that contained geographic knowledge no one else possessed. Portuguese cartography became a state secret so closely guarded that revealing map information to foreigners was punishable by death. Let me explain why maps were considered more valuable than gold. Before the Portuguese exploration efforts, European knowledge of world geography was shockingly limited and wildly inaccurate. Medieval maps were often more symbolic than practical, showing Jerusalem at the center of the world and filling unknown regions with religious imagery and fantastic creatures. Even the best available maps, based on the ancient work of Ptolemy, contained huge errors and left vast regions completely blank. The Portuguese changed this through systematic, careful observation and documentation. Every expedition that left Portugal was required to keep detailed records. Captains and pilots recorded coastal features, depths, currents, wind patterns, and astronomical observations. When ships returned, this information was compiled by expert cartographers at the Casa da India in Lisbon, a government institution established specifically to manage exploration data and trade. The result was the most accurate and comprehensive maps the world had ever seen. Portuguese charts showed the true shape of the African coastline, the position of islands in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, and eventually accurate routes to India, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan. This wasn't speculative geography based on travelers' tales. This was first-hand observational data, corrected and refined through multiple expeditions. Think about what this meant strategically. If you're a Portuguese captain and you have an accurate chart showing safe harbors, dangerous reefs, favorable currents, and the exact position of every landmark along the route to India, you have an overwhelming advantage over any competitor. You can sail quickly and confidently while others move slowly and cautiously or get lost entirely. You know where to find water, where to take shelter from storms, and where dangerous shoals lurk beneath the surface. But Portuguese cartographic innovation went beyond just drawing coastlines. Portuguese navigators and mathematicians developed sophisticated navigation techniques that allowed ships to determine their position in the open ocean with unprecedented accuracy. They refined the use of the astrolabe and quadrant to measure the height of the sun or stars above the horizon, which could then be used to calculate latitude. This might sound simple, but it was actually quite complex. You needed accurate tables showing the sun's declination throughout the year. You needed to know how to correct for the time of day and time of year. You needed instruments calibrated precisely enough to give useful readings on the rolling deck of a ship. Portuguese scientists and navigators worked on all of these problems systematically. The development of navigation tables was particularly important. Portuguese mathematicians compiled tables showing the sun's position for every day of the year at different latitudes. They created star charts showing the positions of key stars in both the northern and southern hemispheres. They developed regimental tables, essentially instruction manuals that told navigators how to use astronomical observations to determine their latitude. These tables were copied by hand and distributed to Portuguese pilots, who guarded them as carefully as the maps themselves. One innovation I find particularly clever was the use of volta do mar, or turn of the sea. Portuguese navigators discovered that the best way to sail south past the Cape of Good Hope wasn't to hug the African coast, but to sail west into the Atlantic, catch the westerly winds of the South Atlantic, and then turn east to approach the Cape from the southwest. This route seems counterintuitive. You're sailing away from your destination, but it used the circular patterns of Atlantic winds and currents to make the journey faster and safer. This kind of knowledge, understanding the wind patterns and ocean currents of the entire Atlantic, represented decades of careful observation compiled from hundreds of voyages. It wasn't something you could learn from books or figure out through theory. It required systematic data collection and sharing of knowledge among experienced pilots. The Portuguese crown understood the value of this information and went to extraordinary lengths to protect it. The Portuguese policy of sigilo, or secrecy, meant that detailed maps and navigation data were classified as state secrets. Cartographers were required to work under supervision in secured areas. Charts were only issued to Portuguese captains just before they sailed, and they were supposed to return them when they arrived home. Foreign spies caught trying to obtain Portuguese maps could be executed. This secrecy policy worked for a while, but ultimately it was impossible to maintain. Portuguese pilots sometimes defected to other nations, taking their knowledge with them. Spanish, English, and Dutch spies managed to obtain copies of Portuguese charts. Shipwrecks sometimes put Portuguese maps into rival hands. By the mid-16th century, much of Portugal's cartographic knowledge had leaked to its competitors. But for several crucial decades, Portugal's superior geographic knowledge gave them a decisive advantage in global exploration and trade. While other nations were still trying to figure out the basics of ocean navigation to Asia, Portugal was already establishing forts, signing treaties with local rulers, and building a trading network that spanned the globe. The irony is that Portugal's secrecy policy, while protecting their advantage temporarily, also limited the advancement of geographic knowledge. If Portuguese discoveries had been published widely and shared with the scientific community, they would have accelerated human understanding of the world. Instead, much valuable information remained hidden in royal archives. Some Portuguese discoveries were so well hidden that they had to be rediscovered later by other explorers. Nevertheless, Portuguese cartography represents one of the great achievements of the Age of Discovery. These were practical men, sailors, pilots, and cartographers who were more interested in what worked than in theoretical geography. They created maps based on observation and experience, maps that could actually guide a ship safely across thousands of miles of ocean. In doing so, they transformed cartography from an art of symbolic representation into a science of precise measurement and documentation. When you use a GPS today to navigate somewhere, you're benefiting from a tradition that Portuguese explorers helped establish. The idea that accurate geographic knowledge is not just interesting, but essential, and that it should be based on careful observation and continuous refinement. They understood, perhaps better than anyone before them, that knowledge of the world is a form of power, and that the nation with the best maps could chart its own destiny. Let me tell you about something that might seem strange to modern ears. There was a time when pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg were luxury items so valuable that men would risk their lives to obtain them, and nations would go to war to control their trade. The Portuguese quest to find a sea route to the source of these spices wasn't just about adding flavor to food. It was about breaking a monopoly that had enriched Middle Eastern traders for centuries and accessing wealth that seemed almost mythical to Europeans. To understand why spices were so important, you need to understand medieval European life. Preservation of food was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, meat had to be salted, dried, or consumed quickly. By late winter, the preserved meat that families had been eating for months was often bland at best and borderline rancid at worst. Spices made this preserved food palatable and were also believed to have medicinal properties. Physicians used spices to treat everything from digestive problems to plague. But here's the problem. The spices Europeans wanted didn't grow in Europe. Pepper came from India, cinnamon came from Sri Lanka and later Indonesia. Cloves and nutmeg came from tiny islands in what is now Indonesia, the Moluccas, or Spice Islands. These spices had to travel thousands of miles through multiple intermediaries before reaching European markets. The traditional spice route was incredibly complex. Spices would be grown in Asia, sold to local traders, transported to ports like Calicut in India or Malacca in Malaysia, sold again to Arab or Indian merchants, shipped across the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea or Persian Gulf, transported overland through the Middle East, sold yet again to Venetian or Genoese merchants in ports like Alexandria or Constantinople, and finally distributed throughout Europe. Each intermediary took their profit, and by the time spices reached European consumers, the markup was astronomical. A pound of pepper that cost relatively little in India might sell for 50 to 100 times that amount in London or Paris. Cloves and nutmeg were even more expensive. There are records of nutmeg being worth more than its weight in gold in some European markets. For context, a successful merchant who controlled a significant portion of the spice trade could become wealthier than many nobles. The Venetian Republic and the Ottoman Empire were the primary beneficiaries of this system. Venice had positioned itself as the middleman between the Middle East and Europe, and their wealth was built largely on the spice trade. The Ottoman Turks, who controlled many of the overland routes through the Middle East, extracted taxes and tolls from this lucrative commerce. Both powers had every incentive to maintain the system and prevent Europeans from finding alternative routes. This is what motivated the Portuguese exploration efforts. Prince Henry the Navigator and his successors understood that if they could find a sea route to the source of spices, bypassing the Middle Eastern middlemen entirely, they could access these goods at their source prices and resell them in Europe at enormous profit. It would break the Venetian-Ottoman monopoly and make Portugal wealthy beyond imagination. The quest took decades of persistent effort. Portuguese ships gradually worked their way down the African coast, establishing trading posts and gathering information. They learned about the monsoon wind patterns that governed trade in the Indian Ocean. They discovered that the African continent could be circumnavigated. And finally, in 1498, Vasco da Gama accomplished what Portugal had been working toward for nearly a century. He found a sea route to India. Da Gama's voyage was an epic journey of exploration and hardship. He left Portugal in July 1497 with 4 ships, sailed down the African coast, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and then navigated up the east coast of Africa. At Malindi, in what is now Kenya, he hired an experienced Arab pilot named Ahmad ibn Majid, who knew the monsoon routes across the Indian Ocean. With Ibn Majid's guidance, da Gama's fleet crossed the Indian Ocean and arrived at Calicut on the Malabar coast of India in May 1498. The initial reception was mixed. The local ruler, the Zamorin of Calicut, was interested in trade, but not particularly impressed with the goods the Portuguese had brought. Da Gama's gifts, cloth, hats, and other European items seemed cheap compared to the luxury goods that arrived regularly from China, Persia, and the Middle East. Arab merchants in Calicut, recognizing the Portuguese as potential competitors, actively worked against them. Despite these challenges, da Gama managed to acquire some spices and began the long journey home. The return voyage was brutal. Disease, particularly scurvy, devastated the crews. Of the approximately 170 men who had left Portugal, only about 55 returned, but the voyage was considered a success because da Gama had proved the route was possible and brought back spices that, even in small quantities, demonstrated the potential profits. The Portuguese quickly followed up on da Gama's discovery. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral led a larger fleet to India, and this expedition accidentally discovered Brazil when storms blew them west across the Atlantic. In 1502, da Gama returned to India with a powerful fleet of warships. This time, the Portuguese weren't coming to trade politely. They were coming to impose their terms. Over the next 2 decades, Portuguese fleets systematically established dominance over the Indian Ocean trade routes. They built fortified trading posts at strategic locations: Goa in India, Hormuz controlling the Persian Gulf, Malacca controlling the strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and eventually Macau in China. They used their superior naval firepower to force local rulers to trade exclusively with Portugal or pay the consequences. The Portuguese strategy was simple but effective. Control the sea lanes, fortify key ports, and monopolize the most valuable trade goods. They didn't try to conquer vast territories inland. That would have required armies they didn't have. Instead, they created a maritime empire, a string of fortified ports and naval bases that allowed them to dominate trade without controlling large populations. The impact on the spice trade was dramatic. Portuguese ships brought spices directly from Asia to Lisbon, cutting out all the traditional intermediaries. Prices in Lisbon were a fraction of what Venetian merchants were charging. The Portuguese crown, which controlled the spice trade as a royal monopoly, generated enormous revenues. For several decades, in the early 16th century, Portugal was one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, far beyond what its small size and population would suggest. Venice and the Ottoman Empire tried to respond. They attempted to block Portuguese access through naval warfare, but Portuguese carracks, with their superior firepower, won most engagements. They tried to maintain their overland routes, but they couldn't compete with the lower prices of spices coming directly by sea. The traditional spice route didn't disappear entirely, but it was fundamentally disrupted. The Portuguese spice monopoly didn't last forever. By the late 16th century, Spanish, Dutch, and English traders were also reaching Asia and competing for spice trade. The Dutch, in particular, eventually displaced the Portuguese as the dominant European power in the Spice Islands. But Portugal had been the first, and for crucial decades, they reaped the benefits. What fascinates me about the spice route revolution is how it demonstrates the power of innovation to disrupt established systems. For centuries, the spice trade had operated in a certain way, controlled by certain powers. Everyone accepted this as the natural order of things. But Portuguese innovation, better ships, better navigation, and the courage to sail into unknown waters completely overturned this system. They proved that geographical barriers that seemed absolute could be overcome with technology and determination. The spice route revolution also marks the beginning of true globalization. Once the Portuguese established direct maritime connections between Europe and Asia, and once they accidentally discovered Brazil in the Atlantic, the world's major continents were connected by sea routes for the first time in history. Trade, ideas, diseases, and people began moving between continents in unprecedented volumes. The world would never be the same. Of course, we must also acknowledge the darker aspects of this revolution. The Portuguese arrival in Asia wasn't a peaceful exchange of goods. It involved violence, coercion, and the imposition of Portuguese power on existing trade networks that had functioned for centuries. Indigenous peoples across Africa, Asia, and later the Americas paid terrible prices for European expansion. The same ships that carried spices also began carrying enslaved people. The wealth that flowed to Portugal came at enormous human cost. But purely from a technological and economic perspective, the Portuguese breaking of the spice monopoly was a watershed moment. It demonstrated that no monopoly, no matter how entrenched, is safe from innovation and determination. It showed that geography is not destiny. Barriers that seem impossible can be overcome. And it proved that a small nation with superior technology and strategy could challenge and defeat much larger, wealthier powers. The next time you reach for pepper or cinnamon in your kitchen, remember that these commonplace seasonings were once precious enough to inspire one of history's greatest adventures, and that Portuguese ships were the vehicles that made these spices accessible to the world. Now let's talk about the specific innovations that made Portuguese ships not just good, but revolutionary. When I say the Portuguese changed naval warfare forever, I'm not exaggerating. The technological advances they pioneered became the foundation for naval supremacy for the next 3 centuries. Let me break down the key innovations that gave Portugal its decisive edge. First, let's talk about hull design and construction. Portuguese shipbuilders perfected carvel planking, a technique I mentioned earlier where hull planks are laid edge to edge rather than overlapping. This might seem like a minor detail, but it had major implications. Carvel-built hulls were smoother, creating less drag and allowing ships to sail faster. They were also stronger and more watertight, crucial for long ocean voyages where a leak could be catastrophic. But it wasn't just about how the planks were attached. Portuguese builders selected their timber carefully, using different woods for different parts of the ship. Oak was preferred for frames and structural elements because of its strength. Pine might be used for planking in less critical areas because it was lighter and more workable. This selective use of materials optimized the strength-to-weight ratio of the vessel. The Portuguese also innovated in keel design. The keel is the backbone of a ship, running along the bottom from bow to stern. Portuguese ships featured deeper, more robust keels than earlier vessels, which improved stability and reduced leeway, the tendency of a ship to drift sideways when sailing against the wind. This deeper keel worked in conjunction with the hull shape to make Portuguese vessels much better at maintaining course in difficult conditions. Now, let's discuss rigging and sail technology. The Portuguese didn't invent the lateen sail or the square sail, but they were masters at combining different sail types to create the most efficient arrangement. The typical Portuguese ship of the 15th century had a complex sail plan that could be adjusted for different wind conditions. The ability to quickly reef sails, reduce sail area in strong winds, was crucial for safety in storms. Portuguese sailors developed efficient systems of lines and blocks that allowed relatively small crews to manage large sail areas. This meant Portuguese ships could operate with smaller crews than earlier vessels of comparable size, reducing costs and extending the range of voyages, since fewer men meant less food and water needed. The Portuguese also improved rigging materials. They developed better rope-making techniques, creating lines that were stronger and more resistant to saltwater degradation. They used innovative block and tackle systems that gave mechanical advantage, allowing sailors to control heavy sails and yards with less effort. But perhaps the most significant Portuguese innovation was in naval gunnery. The Portuguese were among the first to systematically integrate cannons into ship design, and they did it better than anyone else at the time. Earlier ships might carry a few guns on the upper deck, but Portuguese designers created ships with multiple gun decks and proper gun ports that allowed cannons to be mounted low in the hull. Why is the position of cannons so important? Because it affects stability. Heavy cannons mounted high on a ship raise the center of gravity, making the vessel less stable and more prone to capsizing. By mounting cannons lower in the hull, Portuguese ships could carry more firepower without compromising stability. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary at the time. The Portuguese also standardized their artillery. Rather than each ship carrying a random assortment of different caliber guns, Portuguese naval architects designed ships to carry specific numbers and types of cannons in optimized positions. This standardization made it easier to supply ammunition, train gun crews, and develop effective tactics. Portuguese gun crews were trained in rapid-fire techniques that gave them an advantage in naval combat. They practiced loading and firing drills until they could maintain a rate of fire that overwhelmed enemies. In battles in the Indian Ocean, Portuguese ships often faced vessels carrying more men, but Portuguese firepower more than compensated for numerical disadvantage. Navigation instruments were another area where Portuguese innovation shone. While they didn't invent the astrolabe or quadrant, Portuguese navigators and instrument makers refined these tools to make them more practical for use at sea. They developed the mariner's astrolabe, a simplified version of the astronomical astrolabe that was easier to use on the rolling deck of a ship. Portuguese inventors also contributed to the development of the cross-staff and later the backstaff, instruments that allowed navigators to measure the angle of celestial bodies above the horizon without staring directly at the sun. These tools, combined with the navigation tables and charts I discussed earlier, gave Portuguese navigators unprecedented ability to determine their latitude at sea. One innovation that doesn't get enough credit is in ship handling and sailing technique. Portuguese captains and pilots developed sophisticated understanding of ocean winds and currents. They documented the trade winds, the monsoon patterns of the Indian Ocean, the westerlies of the southern latitudes, and the gyres of the Atlantic Ocean. This knowledge allowed them to plan routes that used favorable winds and currents, dramatically reducing voyage times. The Volta do Mar technique I mentioned earlier is a perfect example. Instead of fighting against unfavorable winds and currents, Portuguese navigators learned to use the natural circulation patterns of the ocean. This wasn't just about one specific route. It represented a completely different way of thinking about ocean navigation, work with nature rather than against it. Portuguese sailors also pioneered techniques for handling ships in extreme conditions. They developed methods for surviving hurricanes and typhoons, for dealing with waterspouts and rogue waves, for navigating through dangerous ice fields and fog banks. This accumulated knowledge was passed down through generations of sailors and codified in sailing manuals and pilot books. Ship maintenance was another area of Portuguese expertise. Long ocean voyages put tremendous stress on wooden vessels. Seams would work open, allowing leaks. Rigging would wear and fray. Sails would tear. Wooden hulls would be damaged by shipworms, marine organisms that burrow into wood. Portuguese captains carried skilled carpenters who could make repairs at sea, and ships carried spare parts and materials for emergencies. The Portuguese also developed the practice of careening, beaching a ship and tipping it over to expose the hull for cleaning and repairs. They established careening stations at strategic points along their trade routes where ships could undergo maintenance. This systematic approach to ship maintenance kept the Portuguese fleet operational even on voyages lasting a year or more. One innovation I find particularly clever is in ship provisioning. Portuguese logistics officers developed detailed understanding of what supplies were needed for long voyages and how to preserve them. They experimented with different preservation methods for food, developed systems for keeping water fresh as long as possible, and established supply stations along trade routes where ships could resupply. They learned, through hard experience, about the importance of nutrition in preventing scurvy, though they didn't understand the science behind it. Portuguese sailors discovered that fresh citrus fruits could prevent or cure scurvy, and ships would stop at islands and ports to take on fresh fruit whenever possible. This gave Portuguese sailors a significant advantage in health and survival rates compared to crews that didn't have this knowledge. The cumulative effect of all these innovations was overwhelming. A Portuguese carrack of the early 16th century represented the culmination of decades of systematic improvement in every aspect of ship design, construction, operation, and maintenance. It was faster, stronger, more maneuverable, better armed, and more reliable than any competing vessel. When Portuguese ships arrived in Asian waters, they faced civilizations with long maritime traditions. Arab dhows, Chinese junks, and Indian vessels were sophisticated ships in their own right, products of centuries of development adapted to their specific environments. But they hadn't developed the integration of firepower, hull design, and ocean-going capability that characterized Portuguese vessels. The result was Portuguese maritime dominance that lasted for decades. Other European nations eventually caught up. The Spanish, Dutch, English, and French all learned from Portuguese example and developed their own powerful navies. But for a crucial period in the early 16th century, Portuguese ships were simply the best in the world, and that technological superiority allowed Portugal to build a global empire. What impresses me most is how the Portuguese achieved this through systematic innovation. They didn't rely on one brilliant invention or lucky discovery. Instead, they continuously improved every aspect of ship technology through careful observation, experimentation, and learning from experience. It was innovation as a process rather than as a singular event. This approach, systematic incremental improvement across multiple dimensions, is something we see in every successful technological revolution. The Portuguese maritime revolution teaches us that achieving and maintaining technological superiority requires sustained effort, investment in research and development, training of skilled personnel, and cultivation of expertise. It's a lesson that remains relevant today in any field where technology drives competitive advantage. As we reach the end of our journey through the Portuguese maritime revolution, I want to talk about legacy, how innovations from 500 years ago continue to shape our world today. Because here's the thing, When Portuguese ships set out to explore unknown waters in the 15th century, they weren't just discovering new lands. They were laying the foundation for the interconnected, globalized world we live in now. Let's start with the most obvious legacy: globalization itself. Before Portuguese ships opened ocean routes connecting Europe, Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas, the world's major civilizations existed in relative isolation. Trade occurred, of course, but it was limited and indirect. The Portuguese created the first truly global network of trade and communication. Think about what this means. Today, you can eat food grown on different continents, wear clothes manufactured thousands of miles away, and communicate instantly with people anywhere on Earth. This is so normal to us that we hardly think about it, but it required centuries of development that started with Portuguese ships proving that ocean distances could be bridged reliably and regularly. The Portuguese also pioneered something we now call the Age of Discovery, though we should acknowledge that this discovery often meant the arrival of Europeans in places where people had been living for millennia. Still, from a European perspective, the Portuguese voyages initiated an unprecedented expansion of geographical knowledge. The world map expanded dramatically within a few decades, and this expansion changed how humanity understood its place in the world. Navigation technology has a direct line of descent from Portuguese innovations. The techniques they developed for celestial navigation, using the sun, moon, and stars to determine position, remained fundamental to maritime navigation until the development of radio navigation in the 20th century, and even to some extent until GPS became standard. Modern navigators still learn traditional celestial navigation as a backup, and the principles are exactly those refined by Portuguese navigators 500 years ago. The Portuguese contribution to cartography also echoes through time. Their emphasis on creating accurate maps based on systematic observation rather than speculation or tradition established cartography as a scientific discipline. Modern mapping technologies like GPS and satellite imagery are sophisticated evolutions of the same basic principle: careful measurement and documentation of geographic reality. In terms of ship design, the Portuguese innovations in hull construction, sail configuration, and integration of artillery into ship architecture influenced naval design for centuries. The great sailing ships of the Age of Sail, from Spanish galleons to British ships of the line to American clipper ships, all incorporated design principles pioneered by Portuguese shipbuilders. Even modern sailing yachts use variations of the same hybrid sail plans that made caravels and carracks so effective. The Portuguese model of maritime empire, controlling trade through naval dominance rather than territorial conquest, was copied by every subsequent European maritime power. The Dutch, English, and French all built their empires following the Portuguese blueprint, establish fortified trading posts at strategic locations, maintain naval superiority, monopolize valuable trade goods, and extract wealth without the massive costs of administering large territories. This model shaped world history for centuries. The British Empire, the Dutch East India Company, French colonial ventures in Southeast Asia, all followed patterns established by the Portuguese Estado da India. Even today, the strategic importance of controlling sea lanes and maintaining naval presence in key regions reflects thinking that originated in Portuguese strategy of the 16th century. The economic impact of the Portuguese maritime revolution cannot be overstated. By breaking the spice monopoly and establishing direct trade with Asia, they initiated a fundamental restructuring of the global economy. Prices of many goods fell dramatically in Europe as Portuguese and later Dutch and English merchants brought them directly from source regions. This made formerly luxury goods accessible to broader populations and stimulated demand for Asian products. This trade also created what economic historians call the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, people and cultures between the Old and New Worlds after 1492. While Columbus was Spanish, his voyages were made possible by Portuguese navigation techniques and the example of Portuguese success. The caravel ships that carried Columbus across the Atlantic were Portuguese designs. The Columbian Exchange transformed the world. Crops like potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and cacao moved from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia, dramatically changing cuisines and agriculture. Rice, wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, and countless other species moved to the Americas. This biological revolution, initiated by maritime connections, reshaped ecosystems and societies worldwide. But we must also confront the tragic legacies of Portuguese exploration. The same ships that carried spices and knowledge also initiated the Atlantic slave trade. The same maritime technology that connected civilizations was used to exploit and oppress colonized peoples. The fortunes made from maritime trade often came at terrible human cost, particularly for African and indigenous American populations. The Portuguese were the first European nation to engage systematically in the Atlantic slave trade, and this horrific practice would expand catastrophically under other European powers, lasting for nearly 4 centuries and resulting in millions of deaths and immeasurable suffering. The wealth that built Lisbon's monuments and funded Portugal's golden age was stained with the blood of enslaved people. This is an inseparable part of the legacy we must acknowledge. The environmental impact of Portuguese and subsequent European maritime expansion has also been profound. The introduction of invasive species to new ecosystems, the exploitation of natural resources, the deforestation of islands for ship repair and provisioning, all of these began during the Age of Discovery. Many species of plants and animals were driven to extinction. Traditional ways of life for indigenous peoples were disrupted or destroyed. So when we assess the legacy of Portuguese maritime innovation, we must hold multiple truths simultaneously. These were remarkable technological achievements that expanded human knowledge and capability. They were also part of systems of exploitation and violence that caused tremendous suffering. Both things are true, and understanding history requires us to acknowledge both the innovations and their consequences. In more recent times, Portugal's maritime heritage has become part of their national identity and cultural tourism. The Tower of Belém, from which many exploration fleets departed, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The monument to the discoveries in Lisbon celebrates the explorers of the Age of Discovery. Maritime museums preserve examples of the ships and instruments that made it all possible. Portugal has actively worked to preserve and showcase this heritage, though there's ongoing debate about how to present it honestly while acknowledging its problematic aspects. From a purely technological perspective, what the Portuguese achieved with their ships was extraordinary. They took available technologies, wooden ships, fabric sails, rope rigging, basic navigation instruments, and through systematic innovation and refinement, created vessels capable of voyages their predecessors would have considered impossible. They proved that careful engineering, systematic learning, and persistent effort could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. This is perhaps the most inspiring aspect of the Portuguese maritime revolution. It demonstrates human capability for innovation and achievement. A small nation on the edge of Europe, without vast resources or large population, managed to change the world through intelligence, courage, and determination. They showed that technological leadership doesn't depend only on size or wealth, but on vision, systematic effort, and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. Today, as we face new frontiers, space exploration, deep ocean research, climate change mitigation, we can draw inspiration from the Portuguese example while learning from its mistakes. We can approach new challenges with the same spirit of systematic innovation and persistent effort that characterized Portuguese maritime development. But we can also be mindful of unintended consequences, more respectful of existing cultures and ecosystems, and more equitable in distributing the benefits of exploration and innovation. The ships that Portuguese builders created in the 15th and 16th centuries were more than just vehicles for exploration. They were tools that reshaped human civilization, for better and worse. They connected a divided world, initiated globalization, advanced scientific knowledge, and demonstrated the power of technological innovation. They also enabled exploitation, disrupted traditional societies, and initiated tragic chapters in human history. Understanding this complex legacy, acknowledging both achievements and atrocities, celebrating innovation while recognizing its costs, is essential for understanding not just Portuguese history, but the history of our modern interconnected world. Because, like it or not, we are all living with the consequences of decisions made and innovations created when Portuguese ships first ventured into the Sea of Darkness and returned to tell the tale. And that brings us to the end of this incredible journey through history, from the revolutionary design of the caravel to the firepower of the carrack, from Prince Henry's vision at Sagres to Vasco da Gama's arrival in India, from secret maps that were worth more than gold to the spice routes that enriched a nation. Portuguese ships truly did change the history of the oceans, and in doing so, changed the history of humanity. If this exploration of maritime innovation amazed you, inspired you, or taught you something new, I want you to do 3 things. First, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future deep dives into the technologies and innovations that shaped our world. Second, leave a like on this video to help others discover this incredible story. And third, and this is important, drop a comment below telling me which part of Portugal's naval revolution surprised you the most. Was it the psychological breakthrough at Cape Bojador, the deadly effectiveness of carrack firepower, the state secrecy surrounding Portuguese maps, or something else entirely? I read every comment, and your insights help me understand what topics resonate most and what you'd like to explore next. So join the conversation, share your thoughts, and let's navigate the fascinating currents of history together. Thank you for sailing with me on this journey, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore another incredible chapter in the story of human innovation and achievement. Until then, fair winds and following seas.